Hello, everyone, and happy 2025. This is our first get together this year. I hope everybody had a good New Year's. George is going to do the proper intro for you. I just wanted to say hello and thank you, everyone, for coming. And February, we will be having another one. Professor will be talking about gender. We'll share the date and the details with that soon. Okay. Thanks. Go ahead, George.
Good evening, folks, and thank you for venturing out on this cold evening. I have the pleasure to introduce the Reverend Gretta Vosper. Gretta spoke to us 8 years ago, and then, as now, we invited her at the request of some of our members. For those of you who are not familiar with Gretta, Gretta is an ordained minister of the United Church of Canada. By the way, that's why I said the Reverend, who openly declared herself a non-theist in 2001 and an atheist in 2013. Until her retirement last year, she served as minister at West Hill United Church in Scarborough. Gretta shares her reflection and ideas on her blog, A Whole Lot of Broken, which is hosted on Substack. Her topic tonight will be building community in the lead up to collapse. I won't take more of her time, so let's welcome Gretta.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I was surprised to hear it was 8 years since I was with you. I had calculated that incorrectly, but it's lovely to be invited back. And I'm happy to be joining you in your new home. I hope that you build a lot of community here and enjoy several opportunities to come together and listen to people talk about the things that they're passionate about. Tonight, because I'm retired probably, I'm less giving a lecture as I am going to be preaching, the kind of thing that I would do at West Hill, on a topic that is very dear to my heart and has been for many, many years. The topic of collapse, although I wasn't actually thinking about collapse when I first got involved in this because I certainly didn't think we were going to be headed there. But I've been engaged in climate and the environment since I was at theological college. Probably in 1988 is when I did my first workshop on the climate with the students with whom I was in school. So I've been at this for about 35 years and have been watching things shift and change. Been on protests, participated in workshops, written articles, and the work of bringing climate to the attention of the public has been ongoing in my life since then, to almost no avail. And learning that the United States has pulled out of the Paris Accord was one of the first things that President Trump did, is another one of the spiraling of the earth into a situation in which it is not going to have much to be able to pull itself out of in the next while. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and then equate what you're doing here to what we need to do in order to make a difference in the world and work our way through the difficult times that we are headed toward as we look at collapse going forward. So I think most of us became aware of climate at COP21 in 2015. I think that's when sort of attention was turned toward the climate. There were a lot of protests, a lot of information, a lot of agreements that came out of COP 21 in 2015 in Paris. And I think the world started sort of paying attention to the possibility that things were challenging and that we needed to do something about it. There are a number of strategies that came out as a result of that. I'm not going to talk about them, but many countries made promises and made hopes that they would make some change and be able to slow down what was happening so that we could have time for this sober second thought about how we wanted to be as human community, how we wanted to care for this planet, which is our only home, regardless of, all those billions of planets out there somewhere that we might be able to get to someday. We undoubtedly would not be able to inhabit them. We would be unable to live on them. So this is, as yet, still our only home. So how are we going to take care of that? And COP21 gave us some ideas about that. One of the biggest things that came out of that was the agreement to hold the increase in the temperature of the planet above pre-industrial levels by 1.5 degrees, right? So that's the goal that we've been at since 2016. And we passed that goal last year. 2023 was the first year that we exceeded the planet as a whole, exceeded the 1.5 degrees Celsius that we had been hoping for. So that in itself is like a huge marker of concern and disappointment. So we reached that in 2023. James Hansen, do any of you know James Hansen, the scientist James Hansen, who has been working in climate for many, many years, and he believes that with the systems that are already in flux, that are already shifting, that cannot be changed, that we're actually heading toward a 10-degree increase in the climate of the Earth over the course of the next several decades. None of us are going to be here for that time. So we can live it up and just enjoy the gifts that we have now. We know we're not going to be able to change things, but we can also find ways to mitigate what it is that we leave behind us, and how to do that with some courage and some strength and some help. So the question that people ask regularly is, well, okay, what do we have to do to adapt, right? What do we have to do to adapt to that? Like we can obviously shift the way we build homes maybe, or we can shift the way we work, or we can do a variety of things to try to make a change, right? So that we can adapt to those big changes. Now that we have the proof that they're happening, we can make some adaptation. But what many of us don't know is that humans have lived on the planet and created communities and been able to survive within a very small window of temperature. It's about 13 degrees Celsius, and we can live within that. And anything outside of that, we've never been able to really survive in. So if we're going to adapt, we have to do it in that area, right? But that area is shifting, and we're going to be forced out of it. So what does that mean in terms of our agriculture? What does that mean in terms of aquaculture? I read about a whale today that gave birth, an orca that gave birth, and she gave birth a couple of years ago to a calf that died because all the salmon that would feed that calf were behind a dam that we've built that we won't remove. And so she carried that calf for 17 or 18 days, I think, before she let it go. And she just had another calf, which has also just died. So the life of what's happening in our oceans, which is not just the lungs of the planet, but it feeds billions of humans on the planet. What's happening there is beyond our comprehension, most of us, because we're not intimately familiar with what's going on. It's that big body of water. If you hold the globe one way, yeah, you can see a lot of it, but we don't actually know how we are so dependent upon it and what it's going to do. So an ecosystem failure, people may not know that the word economics means how to run a household, a Greek word. We talk about economics always as though it's something to do with money, but it's not. It's about how to take care of ourselves and our families and how to live within the budget that we have. So our ecosystems, our homes for a variety of life, most of which we don't even understand, but we're threatening it, and little bits and pieces of that start falling apart. And then other things that are built on them that we don't know the relationship with start falling apart as well, until we end up with ecosystem collapse in different areas of the world. And that's going to happen around the world at a greater and greater way. So what's the definition of collapse? What does that mean? Like, does it mean we can't drive our cars anymore? Does it mean we can't get money out of the bank? Does it mean our homes can't be heated and we've got to figure out some other way to stay warm or move to another climate? Collapse is the loss of a collective capacity to meet the basic needs of a population. So we would, here in Canada, some of us might suggest that when Canada was discovered by Europe, and they came to this country and interacted with Indigenous populations, and eventually over the course of a couple of 100 years, 150 years of that interaction, ended up with Indigenous peoples primarily held to small parcels of the land that were foreign to them, that were not part of their culture, that they hadn't, husbanded for centuries to try to survive. And so some people would call that a collapse, that their world collapsed, but it didn't, because they still had family stories. They still had their heritage. They still had their dignity. They still could find and forage for foods that they could take care of. They still had interactions and conversations and engagement that held them together as a society. So the whole society didn't actually, bleed out during that time. Probably more because of who they were than because of any efforts that we were doing to try to preserve them at the time, because I'm sure that we weren't. So if the basic needs of a society are to be given to the society, we need to know what those basic needs are. So some of them I found on a list, but I didn't think it was sufficient, so I've added to it. So some of these basic needs are made up, but if you think there's anything that's superfluous here, just let me know and we can take it off the list and see how you do. One of them is food. Obviously, we need food. We need to be able to eat. We need sustenance on a regular basis. The human body can go without food for quite some time, but basically we need food to survive. We can't live for very long without it. We need water. We need clean drinking water. And that's most of our civilizations have been built around water. We need clothing that is appropriate to where we are and where we're living. It's extremely bloody hot in this room. My clothing is no longer appropriate, but I will keep it on. But we need clothing that's appropriate to the environment that we're in. We need shelter from the elements. Whether, if we live in Florida, you need shelter from the elements there. And shelter in Florida almost always means air conditioning nowadays, because the temperature is so high you can hardly live there. We need shelter here because the environment is harsh in the winter. It can be very hot in the summer, but it's harsh in the winter. So we need to find ways to shelter ourselves. I added sleep. Guess why? Because I never get enough sleep. But sleep, we need sleep. And what do you need for sleep? You need a calm, safe place where you can close your eyes and let yourself go and relax. If you don't have that, if you can't relax, if you're constantly afraid of what's happening, if you're in a situation where you're under threat constantly, you can't sleep, you really need that. And if a society can't protect its people, make them feel safe enough that they can actually rejuvenate and their brain can go through all the things it needs to go through during those hours of sleep, then you're at risk. And then the ability to care for the vulnerable. I was thinking medical care for people who need medicine, elderly care, the very young. If we're not able to care for those people, then we're heading into a very serious concern of our society. So it's only when all of those kind of disappear that we talk about collapse. I think I've already talked about the next one. So how I want to refer to them is not in terms of them collapsing, but about the impacts that will affect them and how we can respond to those impacts. Are there ways that we can engage that can help shore up some of those things, choices that we can make in the way that we live, participation that we can have in our society beyond our own personal family, that we can use to influence some of these so that the impact can be somewhat controlled. So the first basic need that I think is under threat is food, because not many of us have food in our backyards, right? We have food in a local grocery store, and the food in the local grocery store, if it's from a chain, we have no idea where it's come from, but it's not local most of the time. If it's not a chain and it's still a local grocery store, that food has still come from somewhere. If you have had, if you had mandarin oranges over Christmas, they certainly were not local, right? If you're eating tomatoes, not local. I can remember as a child being so excited when the box of grapefruits would show up at Christmas when my grandmother would send it to us from Florida, because we never had grapefruits at that point in time. But now, if we walked into the grocery store and there were no grapefruits, we'd be like, hello, like, what's going on? I want grapefruits, right? We would expect it. We've come to assume that all of these things are available to us, and they're not. So disruption in food systems is going to happen, and I expect it will happen fairly quickly. Because, just think of Palestinian dates, right? You can't get Palestinian dates anymore. And even if things are settled there, the ability to grow dates and olives in Gaza is almost completely gone at this point in time. So the disruption of those items of food that we enjoyed in the past is obviously going to become under threat. Water, we have a pretty good water system here. It's unlikely that anything would happen to it, but all we have to do is watch the news and see what a single disaster can do to a water system. When you have no potable water, you're at risk. If you start drinking stuff that you find on the street, you're at risk. You've got to be able to have clean drinking water. The recommendation for everybody, wherever there's the possibility of any kind of disruption of water services, is that you have 2 gallons per person in your household for at least 2 days, right? So we have a Berkey at home. I drip my water through the Berkey all the time, but I don't have to right now. But I do have it for emergency purposes. If you're stuck, you can go out and find one of those grapevines on the highway, cut it on an angle, get it into a jar, rope it down and hold it down in another jar, and it'll take whatever that filth is that's in this one jar, and it'll give you purely clean water at the other end. That's if you don't want to invest in a Berkey. You should probably look that up on YouTube in case I got some of the details wrong. But so water is huge. If you have one sip of contaminated water, you have no idea what's going to happen to you. So you have to be careful about that. Clothing. Can anyone imagine North Americans not being able to find enough clothing? I think that's pretty nigh on impossible. There is so much clothing in this country. It's unbelievable. So I don't think clothing is urgent for us at this point in time. Shelter, again, I don't think shelter is a huge issue for us unless there was some kind of thing like what has just happened in Los Angeles, where shelter is completely gone. I think that we are at risk like every other demographic in North America, and I think that risk is somewhat limited, but we have no idea what's happening. The weather changes, and it's changing quickly, and we don't know what that might be. So I think our home was just reassessed by an insurance company to be in a flood-threatened zone. So we haven't said that to our insurance company. I hope none of your insurers. We haven't told it. Our neighbor's insurance has been canceled, but those maps are being redrawn right now because things are shifting and changing, and we need to be cautious about how we care for our properties. Sleep, again, I've talked about sleep, and then the vulnerable. Scott had a viral lung infection this year, and we took him to the hospital and sat there for about 13 hours for him to get it misdiagnosed the first time, went home. A few days later, went back, sat there again. He said something about having been there the couple of days previously. They said, no, you haven't. He said, looks familiar to me. There was absolutely no record of his having been there, despite the fact that his OHIP number had been entered, but one under his name is Richard Scott Kearns, and one was under Richard Scott Kearns, the other was under R. Scott Kearns, so it was listed as 2 separate patients. That's a tiny detail, but imagine what our hospital systems are dealing with on a regular basis. And you mess something like that up, it's pretty bad. We have now in our hospitals, they're handing, I remember those little bells that were on the secretary's desk in your high school. They had to ring. Those are now being given to families to have with them in the hallways in our local hospitals for in case anything happens, like somebody dies there. Our hospital system is falling apart. Our ability to care for the vulnerable in our own society is falling apart. And we aren't able to sustain it or change it or fix it ourselves. We just have to rely on those people that we elect to ensure that what it is they're going to try to do with it is a positive thing instead of just sucking everything out of it. And I have no idea what the current government's position on hospitals is. I haven't paid attention, but so one of the big things that I think that we have to do, and I know personally I need to do this, is how we care for ourselves as the stress of this situation continues to grow. How do we take care of our own mental health? How do we take care of our own emotional stability? How do we make changes in our lifestyle that are congruent with our concerns, right? So almost all of my clothes now are thrifted. I haven't bought new clothes for years, right? Because it's all thrifted stuff, except my bottoms are actually from an Indigenous designer in Winnipeg. But we have to find ways that we can do stuff that is positive towards the climate. And consumption is one of the biggest things that we do. I watched a short video on YouTube the other day of a woman who they decided that they were not going to shop. They just decided they weren't going to shop anymore, right? Because they spent hours just going around stores and picking stuff up and coming home with stuff. And she showed the list of things that they owed money on. When they started this, they had a massive truck, they had a motorhome, they had a house, and their mortgage costs were like in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And after several years of this, like 5 or 6 or something, I don't remember, they had money in the bank because they just weren't spending it on all that stuff that you just pick up when you're out. Oh my gosh, honey, that is so nice. I love that. That would look really great someplace, right? So Scott and I ever get hankering for that, we go to, the Mission Thrift Store, or we go, to Value Village or something like that. I hate Value Village, but and we find things that we like. But that's been a complete shift from going to Winners and Home Sense and looking at things and going to second loved things and, finding stuff that we like. So making that kind of shift, eating, making a shift in terms of eating, making our own food at home. Scott is the cook. I got really sick back in 2011, and Scott had to make all the food, but he didn't know how to make a grilled cheese sandwich. One time I was going to a meeting and I said, I'm not going to be able to make your dinner. And he goes, what am I going to eat? And I said, make a grilled cheese. He goes, I don't know how to make a grilled cheese sandwich. So he now does all the cooking. I couldn't eat. And he went to the grocery store and he'd say, somebody picked something up. He goes, what is that? And the person would tell him what it was. And he said, well, what do you do with it? And he'd tell they'd tell him, and he'd bring it home and do it. And that's how he learned to cook. So now he's the most amazing cook, and I rely on him every single day. So cooking at home, making it a family event, enjoying doing it. Not that you can still come here and have a good time. But eating at home is something that so many of us are not used to doing anymore. We just go and pick something up at the fast food, or we go out for dinner or whatever. So those kinds of things can make a significant change in terms of climate too. Julia Holtz talks about a thing that's called social prescribing for people who are showing up at hospitals who have problems that aren't really medical, but could be dealt with in some other way. And so physicians, particularly, she's talking about the UK, physicians are doing this social prescribing. So they'll say, well, what do you like to do? And the person says, well, I don't know, I like walking. So they write a script and they say, okay, you've got to walk, right? And that's their prescription, right? So they do all these kinds of things, and it's a great idea. I mean, if I said I love bowling and then someone said, well, you have to go bowling, that would be great, except I hate bowling. So this social prescribing has become quite popular in the UK. And doctors say that they enjoy writing a script for beauty, right? You have to go find beauty, or you have to go and learn to paint, or something like that, right? But another scientist who studies this, Cormac Russell, hates it, thinks it's the worst thing that's ever happened, because it's taking the real problem and putting another Band-Aid over it. And the real problem, and this is what I want to talk to you about, is not that somebody's feeling needs to be out in nature more. It's that somebody has lost community. They have completely lost community. They've lost connection. They've lost being with people. They're eating alone. And even if you tell them, well, go do some forest bathing. Well, okay, so you go out and you walk around in the forest alone, right? Or you start painting alone in your condo, right? So Cormac Russell says that's not the answer. that's actually a symptom of the problem. The problem is we are not together enough. We are not coming together and falling in love with being together, which we used to do. Which is why this group and church have so much in common. Because you come together, you laugh, and you enjoy each other, and you get to know each other, and you fall in love with being together. That's what I always say. I always refer to West Hill as a place where you came so that you could fall in love with being together. That's my definition of church, is the place that you come to fall in love with being together. How many of you had families that grew up in a religious community when you were younger? 2, sort of. Okay. So some of you may or may not know what I'm talking about, but the church that I went to, Sydenham Street United Church, was a Methodist church, huge place. It's been turned into something called the Spire now. It's a great concert venue because it has this fantastic space and organ, so it's a venue. And that was out my back door, right? I could see the church steeple from my window, and we would just go out the back door and cross the street and go to church. At the corner, out the front door, was Chalmers United Church. It was a Presbyterian church, which came into Union. And down the street had been another one, a Congregationalist church, which had been broken down for development, taken down for development. So there were 3 massive churches in my neighborhood as I was growing up. The church that I went to sat probably about 1,000, 1,100 people. And it was usually, when I was a kid, it was pretty close to full. The balcony had so many people in it. My dad was on the Treasury group, and my mom was on the UCW. I'm so proud of her because she shut the UCW down. That's the United Church of Women. She shut it down in the 1960s, said it was going to die anyway. I thought that was fantastic. Just a leader, a pioneer. But the church was the place where all the cookies went. If I got home and there was a whole bunch of cookies on the counter, they were on their way to the church. It really annoyed me when it was butter tarts. Like, could we not have the butter tarts? So they went to the church. The minister lived across the street, and my mom and his wife spent so much time together. I knew people there. I knew that if I was in trouble, I knew what homes I could go to be cared for. I knew that I would be cared for by Mrs. Jackson. I knew I could call Mrs. McNevin. I knew that I knew those people. It was like an extended family. That's what church was in the 1950s and 60s when I was growing up. It's not like that anymore because the church I served in Kingston had a massive parking lot because everybody drove there. No one lived close enough to walk to it. Everybody drove. There was no community built in there that held anything more than church events. So if you were there for a Sunday, or you were there for a dinner, or you were there for the church sale, you would come. Like even the shortbreads, legendary shortbreads that they made for that sale, it was the same recipe. Everybody made it in their own kitchen. They didn't come to the church to be together to do the shortbreads. It wasn't creating the same kind of community as was so prevalent in the 1950s and 1960s. So the question is, how do we do this? How do we do this? How do we create these kinds of communities? Because none of you, I don't think, want to start a church in your neighborhood, right? Not likely. For tax purposes, maybe, yes. Well, there's a possibility. Anyway, Shani Graham is a woman who grew up in Gibsons. Does anyone remember what Gibsons, the fame of Gibsons is? Oh, come on, I'm not that old. Gibsons in British Columbia. The Beachcombers.
I remember the Beachcombers.
Oh, thank you. Okay. All right. The Beachcombers was a CBC show that was on for decades, and it was filmed in Gibsons, BC. So Shani Graham grew up in Gibsons, BC, and she's since moved to Australia. But she's become a very sought-after speaker because of some of the changes that she's made in the neighborhoods that she's worked with. And one of the things that she's done is invited individuals to create communities in their communities. Now, Scott and I live in a suburb. How many of you live in a suburb? How many of you live how many of you live in an urban area that's in a house that's old, more than 60 years old? Maybe? Okay. Okay, all right. That's barely 60. Okay, maybe 90 years old. Anybody live in a house that's 90 years old? Okay, so we are creating communities and have been for decades that have curved streets to control the traffic, that have a school in them somewhere. They all have driveways. One side of the street has a sidewalk, the other side doesn't. They've got matched trees that go down the boulevard, so when, the ash disease went through, it wiped out all the trees. Scott and I live in one of those houses built in 1983, and it's in a suburb that was built in Whitby. Those kinds of suburbs have no place where I can walk to the corner store. There were 2 corner stores from where I grew up. I could go up or down, right? But here I have to get in the car and drive somewhere if I need something, because you can't walk that distance. At least I can't walk that distance to get to the store and back with any ease. So they have schools. The school that's closest to ours is a French immersion school. So most of the children who, if they don't go to French immersion, they have to be driven to another school that's at a distance. There are, if you walk through the neighborhood, there are places where there are 3 or 4 driveways in a row that have basketball nets in them. No one ever playing basketball, but they've all got a net, their own personal net. And the kids come home from school, they walk home from school on one side of the street, and then, I don't know, maybe the ones on the other side of the street don't have kids. Scott and I moved in 2011. We've never been in the homes of the people who live on either side of us. Not for lack of trying. I made 3 jars of different flavored cranberry sauce and took it to them for 10 years before I finally stopped. But the neighborhoods are not conducive to getting to know your neighbor. When I lived in downtown Toronto, just off the Danforth, you knew everybody on the street, right? Because they all walked by your house and you had a front porch you could sit on and you chatted with each other. So our communities do not bring us together, right? So you need to do that actively because it doesn't happen organically, right? You need to make a church out of your community. The kind of church I grew up in, not the kind of church I served most of the time, which was almost always suburban, but the kind of church I grew up in where people come together and do things together, right? They brainstorm what it is they want to do. And actually, when Shani Graham started doing this, she would get committees together to do it. And they would dream up ideas, and then the committee would decide they were going to do it. Well, it didn't last for very long because people got so tired of having meetings. So they just set up a WhatsApp page, and people would put on the WhatsApp page what they were going to do. So I've got a list of the things that have happened in that community. They've had movies in the park. Anybody have a park near them? Movies in the park. Games night. Somebody taught a bread making class. Christmas caroling or some kind of singing. I can't imagine what that might be. A clothes swap. Felt making workshop. Could be interesting. Soup and slice, which I assume is just like a soup and a sandwich or soup and a piece of cake. Soup and a piece of cake would be nicer. Pizza. I like the cake idea better. Yeah, okay. Pizza, okay. Picnics. A solstice bonfire. Like how cool would that be, right? In the middle of winter, right? A winter solstice. I mean, this was a place, someplace in the south. A long table dinner. This place had an alley, and they just brought the tables out and filled the entire alley with tables, and everybody brought them. They had a potluck dinner. They built a community garden. Anyone know of a space in your neighborhood that could host a garden if you got the right permission or just started accidentally dropping seeds? Right? Tree planting. And one of the stories that she tells in one of her TED Talks is about at one point they heard glass breaking. She and her partner heard glass breaking, ran outside. Half the neighborhood had run outside. Someone had broken into someone's house. And so they went and they knocked on the door immediately. And these 2 young guys came running out terrified, right? Because they'd just been caught. But by the whole neighborhood, right? Because they all knew each other and they were taking care of each other. So one of them fessed up, the other one hightailed it out of there. But it developed a relationship with a kid who was breaking into the house, right? So because they had established such deeply intense relationships where they were. So this is what I think has disappeared with church because we didn't, the term husbanding, like husbandry, animal husbandry, where you take care of, you nurture, you make sure they have everything they need. we did a very bad job of animal husbandry when it came to the church, when we parked them in, and when it came to people in general, when we put everybody into suburbs, when we separated them from each other, where no one sees anybody because you get out of your car in your garage and you're not really sure if anybody lives in any of those houses on the street or not because you don't see anyone. There's a lot of dogs in our neighborhood, so I do see people walking dogs all the time, but we don't know the people next door well enough to be able to run out in the middle of the night if you hear someone smash their window, right? If you just sort of go, oh, I wonder what that was, and roll over. We have not done what we need to do as a human family. We have not protected one another, and in so doing, we have not protected ourselves. So collapse for me is the lead up to collapse is an incredible opportunity for us to look at what we are doing and do it differently, to look at the people who live on either side of us and say, I've been here for a long time and you've never had me over, but would you like to come over and see what I've done to the house? It's really awesome, right? Or I've been growing some tomatoes. We grow tomatoes in our driveway, right? No one has ever taken a bloody tomato off our plants. Like, we've got these tomatoes. If you see one that we haven't picked yet and it looks right, help yourself. Scott will probably, he's the one who takes care of them. He's probably not happy that I just said that. But let's do some things like that. Let's think about who it is you do know in your neighborhood, who you might be able to say, this woman was talking the other night about maybe getting to know everybody here. Maybe I said to Scott, what if we had and we might be the only people in our house that have, 4,000 books, but what if we decided to say, let's have a book swap. We'll host it in our driveway and we'll tell people in the whole community, bring the books you want to switch out and just come and take whatever you want, right? I know ours would all still be there at the end of the day, but other people might switch some books around. But what could you do? There's one thing that church and army did right. Both of them did it, and they did it for exactly the same reason. And it was force their members to sing together. Because if you sing together, you become one. You resonate with one another. In the army, it was like to make you feel like part of the group, to be part of a body of people. In the church, it was the same thing. It was to make you feel so grounded in that community that you would die for it, literally, right? And religion has often called for people to die for it, right? Well, if you were singing together, you could do that. I was going to make you sing a song, but I wasn't sure I would know of one that you all knew. Mickey Mouse? Why? M-O-U-S-E, Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse. I don't know the rest of it. I was going to make you sing 100 bottles of beer on the wall, but I thought I was so old you wouldn't know that one. Sorry, Sky? What was that next verse? Well, I don't know. Somebody have a song. Let's have a song.
You know what she wanted to do? She was going to do 99 bottles of beer.
Yeah. Okay. Do you know that? 99 bottles of beer on the wall, 99 bottles of beer. Take one down and pass it around. 98 bottles of beer on the wall, 98 bottles of beer on the wall, 98 bottles of beer. You take one down and pass it around. 97 bottles of beer on the wall. Okay, keep going. Oh, come on. Oh, you forgot the lyrics?
I was a Baptist, so we didn't sing that.
Oh.
We sang if one of those bottles should happen to fall, they'll be less because we didn't drink. So
Oh, okay. But you did use beer bottles? That's very
no, it
interesting.
wasn't. It was
Oh, Papa, of course it was. Anyway. So I really want to come back here in a year, and because I hope you make this a really great home, and that you meet here regularly and you draw some people from interesting places. I want to come back in a year and I want to hear the stories. I want to know who taught knitting to a group of kids. I want to know who took a bunch of men and said, okay, this is how you sew, right? I want you to say, who wants to teach beer making, right? to a group of people, and then bring it in here one day and share it around and bring them here with you so that they get to know this community. I want to know who has an idea that they have the courage to share with the people on your street. Even if the first thing is just, do you want to come in and have a cup of tea? And then talk about who else you might have to tea, or where you might go for a walk in the neighborhood, or what you might do with that empty park down the end of the street, or how you might approach the person whose dog next door does nothing but bark and bark and bark and bark. I don't know. How can you have those conversations? How can you create church on your street without religion, without belief, without all the lyrics to dead hymns, and without all of that stuff, but with the wanting to be together because you fall in love with being together, and because that becomes one of the most important things in your day, is connecting with someone that you feel like that about. So that's my hope for church going forward, that it'll happen on little streets in out of the way places and around the corner in the suburb where, you know, you thought it was a dead end, but it turns out to be nothing but life unfolding in some extraordinary way. And that we find our way to hold one another's hearts as we go through these incredible changes that are coming. And that we teach our children and our grandchildren how to do that too, so that they never feel the isolation that so many in our generation feel, and in the generation before us feel, as they go through their later years in their lives. Let's find a way to invite people into that holy space that is us and make something beautiful of it. Thank you.